gun barrel pressed against Florence Dawson's temple felt colder than the January wind whistling through the canyon, but her hands never shook as she stared down the banker who thought he owned everything in Oro Grande, New Mexico, including her future. She had refused his marriage proposal 3 times, and now Thomas Hartwell stood in her modest ranch house with 2 hired men flanking him, demanding she reconsider or lose everything her father had built before consumption took him 6 months prior. It was 1882, and women were supposed to accept their circumstances with grace and gratitude, but Florence had never been particularly good at following expectations. Her father had raised her to think for herself, to shoot straight, to manage cattle and negotiate prices, and now the entire town seemed personally offended that she intended to keep running the ranch herself rather than marry into respectability. Hartwell controlled the bank, held the mortgage on half the properties in town, and had made it clear that Florence's note would come due early unless she agreed to become his wife. He was 47 years old with thin lips and calculating eyes, and the thought of his hands on her made Florence's stomach turn. "You have until tomorrow evening to give me your answer," Hartwell said, finally lowering the weapon his man held. "Otherwise, I will foreclose on this property and you will have nothing. A woman alone cannot maintain a cattle ranch. You need a husband, Miss Dawson, whether you wish to admit it or not." After they left, Florence sat in her father's old chair and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of despair before she began planning. She had 40 head of cattle, 3 horses, and enough supplies to last through winter if she was careful. What she did not have was the $2,000 Hartwell claimed she owed, a sum that had mysteriously doubled from what her father's records showed. She suspected forgery, but proving it would require resources she lacked, and a court system that had already demonstrated little interest in helping a stubborn woman who refused to know her place. That night, Florence loaded her father's rifle, barred the door, and tried to formulate a plan that did not end with her either married to a man she despised or homeless in the New Mexico winter. Sleep came in fitful intervals, and she woke before dawn to the sound of cattle lowing in distress. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside in her nightdress and boots to find 2 men attempting to cut out her best breeding stock under cover of darkness. "Get away from my cattle!" She fired a warning shot over their heads, and both men wheeled their horses around. She recognized them as 2 of Hartwell's ranch hands, confirming her suspicion that the banker intended to take everything one way or another. "Hartwell sent us to collect collateral," one of them called back. "You might as well let us take them peaceful-like." "You tell Hartwell he'll get his answer when I'm good and ready to give it, and not a moment before. Now get off my property before the next shot isn't a warning." They left, but Florence knew they would be back with more men. She spent the morning moving her cattle closer to the house, checking her ammunition, and considering her limited options. She could try to drive the herd to Santa Fe and sell them, but Hartwell had friends throughout the territory, and a woman traveling alone with cattle would be an easy target. She could go to the sheriff, but Sheriff Morrison had made his position clear when he suggested that perhaps Miss Dawson should consider that marriage to a successful man like Hartwell was not such a terrible fate. The sound of a horse approaching around noon made her grab her rifle again, but the rider who appeared was not one of Hartwell's men. He was tall and lean, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. He wore a dusty brown coat, a black hat pulled low, and had several days' worth of stubble on his angular jaw. As he drew closer, Florence could see he was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps 25 or 26, with startling green eyes that surveyed her property with interest. "This is private property," Florence called out, keeping her rifle pointed toward the ground but ready to raise it if necessary. She was 22 years old and had learned the hard way that appearing vulnerable invited trouble. The stranger stopped his horse a respectful distance away and raised both hands to show they were empty. "I can see that, madam. I am looking for work, and I heard in town there might be a ranch out here that needed an extra hand." "You heard wrong. I am not hiring." "Are you sure about that?" "Because from what I observed in town, you have got about a dozen men waiting for an excuse to ride out here and cause you trouble, and I did not see anyone else standing guard." His voice was calm, almost conversational, with an accent that suggested he had spent time back east despite his cowboy appearance. Florence studied him more carefully. What is your interest in my troubles? I need work. You need help. Seems straightforward enough. He slowly lowered his hands and leaned forward slightly in his saddle. Name is Lucas Darrow. I have worked cattle from Texas to Montana, and I am decent with a gun when necessary. I am not asking for much, just food and a place to sleep until spring. What makes you think I can afford to pay anyone? I heard that too. I am willing to work for room and board if you throw in $20 when I move on. That is all I need to get to Colorado. It was too convenient, and Florence's instincts screamed caution. Why would you work for almost nothing? What are you running from? Lucas Darrow smiled for the first time, and it transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly warm. Nothing criminal, if that is your concern. I left a ranch in Texas where the owner's daughter decided I would make a suitable husband. I disagreed. Her father was less understanding about my position than I would have liked, so I decided it was time to see other parts of the territory. Despite herself, Florence felt a flicker of kinship. So you are also running from someone who thinks they can decide your future for you. Something like that. His expression grew more serious. Look, Miss Dawson, I understand if you do not trust me, but I watched those men ride away from your property looking frustrated, and I am guessing they will be back with reinforcements. You can spend your time trying to defend this place alone, or you can accept help from someone who has no stake in whatever local politics are playing out. I do not know you, do not know them, and do not care about anything except earning enough to continue north come spring. Florence made a decision that was either incredibly wise or phenomenally stupid. There is a bunkhouse behind the barn. It is not fancy, but it is warm and dry. I can offer 2 meals a day and the $20 you mentioned, but I need to be clear about something. I am not looking for a husband, a partner, or anything except someone to help me keep my cattle safe and my property intact. If you have any other intentions, you should ride on now. Understood completely, madam. I promise I am not in the market for a wife either. Lucas dismounted and extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Florence shook it. His grip was firm but not crushing, his palm calloused from hard work. You can call me Florence. If we are going to be working together, we might as well skip the formalities. Florence it is. Lucas glanced around the property with an appraising eye. Why don't you tell me exactly what we are dealing with here, and we could figure out the best way to defend your ranch? Over the next hour, Florence explained the situation with Hartwell, the suspicious mortgage increase, and the pressure from the entire town for her to accept her proper place as a wealthy man's wife. Lucas listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. So essentially, Hartwell wants your land, and he has figured out the easiest way to get it is to force you into marriage or foreclosure, Lucas said when she finished. The question is why? This is decent rangeland, but it is not worth the effort he is putting into acquiring it unless there is something else here he wants. Florence had wondered the same thing. My father mentioned once that he thought there might be silver in the hills beyond the north pasture, but he never had the equipment or expertise to explore properly. Hartwell has been trying to buy this property for 3 years, ever since those rumors started circulating. That would explain his persistence. If he marries you, he gets the land and any mineral rights that might be valuable. If he forecloses, he gets the same thing through the bank. Lucas pushed his hat back and looked at her directly. What do you want to happen here, Florence? Because defending this place is one thing, but if you want to actually keep it long-term, we need a different strategy. I want to keep my ranch, pay off whatever I legitimately owe, and make sure Hartwell understands I will never be anyone's convenient acquisition. The words came out more vehement than Florence intended, but she was tired of being treated like property to be negotiated over. All right then, first thing we need to do is secure your cattle and make sure they cannot be stolen or driven off. Second, we need to find out the real amount of your mortgage and see if there is any way to challenge Hartwell's numbers. Third, we need to make sure you stay safe until we can figure this out. Lucas started walking toward the barn as he spoke, already evaluating sight lines and weak points. How many men can Hartwell call on if he decides to force the issue? 12, maybe 15 if he pulls in everyone who owes him favors or money. And we have 2 people, 1 rifle, and the element of surprise since he does not know I am here yet. Lucas turned back to face her. I am not going to lie to you, Florence. Those are not good odds, but I have been in worse situations and survived. The key is going to be making Hartwell believe that taking this ranch by force will cost him more than it is worth. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Lucas revealed himself to be exactly what he claimed, a skilled ranch hand who knew how to work efficiently and think strategically. He helped Florence move the cattle to a box canyon on her property that could be easily defended, set up warning bells on the perimeter, and reinforce the doors and windows on the house. By nightfall, they were both exhausted and covered in dust, but the ranch was as secure as they could make it with limited resources. Florence cooked dinner while Lucas tended to the horses, and they ate together at her small kitchen table. It felt strange to have another person in her house after 6 months of solitude, but Lucas was an easy presence, speaking when conversation felt natural but comfortable with silence as well. "You said your father raised you to run this ranch," Lucas said as he helped her clean the dishes. "That is unusual for this territory. Most men want their daughters focused on needlework and finding a husband." "My mother died when I was 7, and my father did not have the luxury of raising me to be decorative. He needed help running this place, so he taught me everything he knew." Florence smiled at the memory. "The other ranchers thought he was crazy, and their wives were scandalized. They still are. I have been told more than once that my father's unconventional approach ruined me for proper society." "Proper society seems overrated." Lucas handed her the last clean plate. "My mother tried to raise me to be a gentleman. She had aspirations of me attending university back east and becoming a lawyer or banker. Instead, I learned I would rather work with my hands and sleep under the stars than spend my life in stuffy offices arguing about contracts." "How did she take that revelation?" "About as well as you would expect. She told me I was wasting my potential and breaking her heart." Lucas's expression grew sad. "She died 3 years ago, still disappointed in my choices. I regret that I could not be what she wanted, but I would have been miserable trying to fit into that life." Florence understood that feeling more than she could articulate. "The whole town thinks I'm selfish and unnatural because I would rather run my own ranch than become Hartwell's wife and hostess. They believe a woman's highest calling is supporting her husband and raising children, and my refusal to embrace that role makes them uncomfortable." "You know what I find interesting?" Lucas leaned against the counter, his green eyes thoughtful. "Everyone is so concerned about the molds they think people should fit into that they forget to ask whether those molds actually make sense. You are good at running this ranch. You clearly love this land, and you have every right to defend what your father built. But instead of respecting that, they want to force you into a shape that has nothing to do with who you actually are. And you were good at being a ranch hand, clearly loved the work, but your mother wanted you to be something completely different." "Exactly. We are supposed to apologize for knowing ourselves and wanting to live authentically." Lucas pushed away from the counter and headed toward the door. "Well, I have never been good at apologizing for being myself, and I do not think you should either. We will figure out how to save your ranch, Florence, and we will do it without you having to compromise who you are." After Lucas left for the bunkhouse, Florence sat in her father's chair and allowed herself to feel something she had not experienced in months: hope. Lucas Darrow was a stranger who had appeared at exactly the right moment, and she still was not entirely sure why he was really helping her, but his presence had already changed the calculation of her situation. She was no longer alone and facing impossible odds. She had an ally, someone who seemed to understand instinctively what she was fighting for and why it mattered. The next morning, Florence woke to the smell of coffee and found Lucas had already started a fire in the kitchen stove and put on a pot to brew. It was a small gesture, but it spoke to a thoughtfulness she had not expected. "I figured you would want to get an early start," Lucas said when she emerged from her bedroom. "Hartwell is expecting an answer today, and we need to decide how you want to handle that." Florence poured herself a cup of coffee and considered her options. "If I refuse him directly, he will foreclose immediately and probably bring men to force me off the property. If I ask for more time, he will see it as weakness and push harder." "What if you tell him you need to verify the mortgage amount before you can make a decision? That you want to see your father's original paperwork and compare it to his records?" Lucas suggested. It is reasonable enough that he cannot refuse without looking suspicious, and it buys us time to investigate whether he has been defrauding you. The bank has the original documents. I have copies, but Hartwell could claim they have been altered. Is there anyone in town who might have kept independent records, a lawyer your father worked with? Or maybe the previous bank manager? Florence thought about it. My father's lawyer died 2 years ago, but there is a land office in Santa Fe that should have records of all property transactions. If I could get there and back, I could request copies of everything filed when my father bought this property. How long would that take? 4 days round trip if the weather holds and I push hard, less if I take the stagecoach. Florence met Lucas's eyes. But that would mean leaving you here alone to defend the property if Hartwell decides to move while I am gone. I can handle it. The question is whether you trust me enough to leave me in charge of your ranch for 4 days. It was a fair question, and Florence appreciated that Lucas asked it directly. She studied the man sitting across from her, trying to read what lay beneath his calm exterior. Every instinct she had said that Lucas was exactly what he appeared to be, a drifter who had stumbled into her troubles and decided to help for reasons that probably had more to do with his own principles than any ulterior motive. He could have easily ridden on and avoided the whole situation, but he had chosen to stay. Yes, Florence said finally, I trust you. But if Hartwell comes with 12 men, I do not expect you to die defending my property. You should take the horses and go. Lucas smiled slightly. I appreciate the permission to exercise common sense, but I am not planning on dying or abandoning your ranch. I am planning on being smart enough and convincing enough that Hartwell decides attacking this place is not worth the trouble. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for Florence's trip to Santa Fe. She would take the stagecoach from Oro Grande, which meant she had to go into town and face Hartwell directly. Lucas suggested she tell the banker that she needed to retrieve her father's documents from a safe deposit box in Santa Fe before she could proceed with any business arrangements. It was close enough to the truth that she could deliver it convincingly. At noon, Florence changed into her best dress, a dark blue wool that was several years old but still respectable, and pinned her auburn hair into a neat bun. She strapped her father's pistol under her cloak, hoping she would not need it, but unwilling to go into town unarmed. Lucas saddled her horse and walked with her to the edge of the property. If anything happens, there's a signal fire prepared on that ridge. He pointed to the high point overlooking the ranch. Light it, and I will come running. Otherwise, I will see you in 4 days. Lucas. Florence hesitated, then decided to simply say what she was thinking. Thank you. I do not know why you are really doing this, but I am grateful you are here. Sometimes people help because it is the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return. Lucas handed her the reins. Go get your evidence, Florence. We will save your ranch. The ride into Oro Grande took 40 minutes, and Florence spent the time rehearsing what she would say to Hartwell. The town was small, just a main street with a bank, general store, saloon, hotel, and a few other businesses clustered together. Everyone knew everyone else's affairs, which meant Florence's arrival would be noted and discussed within minutes. She tied her horse outside the bank and walked in with her head high, refusing to show any of the anxiety churning in her stomach. Hartwell was in his office, visible through the glass window that allowed him to survey the entire bank floor. He looked up when she entered and gestured for her to join him. Miss Dawson, I am pleased to see you have come to your senses. Hartwell stood as she entered his office, his expression smug with anticipated victory. I have come to discuss business, Mr. Hartwell, not to accept any proposals. Florence remained standing, not wanting to settle into the chair he offered. I need clarification on my father's mortgage before I can proceed with any decisions. Specifically, I would like to understand how the amount owed has apparently doubled since his death. Hartwell's expression hardened. Your father took out an additional loan 6 months before he died to cover medical expenses. That loan, combined with the original mortgage and accumulated interest, brings the total to $2,000. I have shown you the paperwork. I would like to verify those numbers against the records filed with the territory. I'm taking the stage to Santa Fe this afternoon to retrieve copies of all transactions related to my property. Once I have confirmed the accurate amount owed, I will make arrangements to pay my legitimate debts. There is no need for such dramatic gestures. Miss Dawson, I assure you my records are completely accurate. Hartwell moved around his desk, standing too close in a way that made Florence want to step back. She held her ground. However, if you insist on this course of action, I must warn you that any delays in payment will result in additional interest and penalties. I am certain they will. I will return in 4 days with accurate information, and we can proceed from there. Florence turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Hartwell. If any of your men set foot on my property while I'm gone, I've instructed my ranch hand to defend it with all necessary force. I would hate for anyone to get hurt over a misunderstanding. She left before Hartwell could respond, feeling his anger like heat against her back. Outside, she bought a ticket for the afternoon stage and tried to calm her racing heart. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in Oro Grande, and there was no going back now. The stagecoach arrived on schedule, and Florence climbed aboard with 2 other passengers, a traveling salesman heading to Albuquerque and an older woman visiting her daughter in Santa Fe. Neither seemed particularly interested in conversation, which suited Florence fine. She spent the journey watching the landscape roll past and worrying about what might be happening at her ranch. They stopped for the night at a way station, where Florence paid for a tiny room and barely slept on the hard mattress. The next morning they continued to Santa Fe, arriving in the afternoon. Florence had been to the territorial capital twice before with her father and knew her way to the land office. She filed her request for copies of all documents related to her property, paid the fee, and was told to return the following morning. With time to spare, Florence found an inexpensive boarding house and paid for a room, then spent the evening walking the streets of Santa Fe and trying not to imagine all the ways her plan could go wrong. Lucas was a capable man, but he was still just one person against Hartwell's resources. If the banker decided to foreclose immediately and send men to seize the property, there was little Lucas could do to stop him. She returned to the land office first thing the next morning and received a thick envelope containing copies of her father's original land purchase, mortgage documents, and all subsequent filings. Florence paid the clerk, found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe, and began reviewing everything carefully. What she discovered made her blood boil. The mortgage her father had taken out was for $800, not $2,000. There was no record of any additional loan taken 6 months before his death. Either Hartwell had created fraudulent documents, or he had given her father a private loan with exorbitant interest that was never properly recorded. Either way, it suggested the banker was engaged in practices that would not hold up under legal scrutiny. Florence gathered the documents and went to find a lawyer. She chose a firm that looked established and respectable, walked in, and asked to speak with someone about territorial land law. A young lawyer named Samuel Garrett agreed to review her case and spent an hour going through all the paperwork she had brought from both the land office and her own records. "This is clearly fraudulent," Garrett said finally. "Either Mr. Hartwell has forged additional loan documents, or he gave your father an illegal private loan with interest rates that violate territorial usury laws. Either way, you have grounds to challenge this in court." "How long would that take?" "Several months, possibly longer if Hartwell fights it aggressively, and I'm obligated to tell you that taking on a banker with Hartwell's resources and connections is not without risk." Garrett leaned back in his chair, studying Florence with curiosity. "Why does he want your property so badly?" "I believe there may be silver deposits in the hills behind my ranch. Hartwell has been trying to acquire the land for years. That would explain his willingness to engage in questionable practices. If he thinks there is significant mineral wealth, he stands to profit enormously." Garrett pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. "Here is what I recommend. You need to file a formal complaint with the territorial governor's office alleging fraud and demanding an investigation into Hartwell's banking practices. That will freeze any foreclosure proceedings while the investigation is underway. It will also put Hartwell on notice that you are not going to be an easy target. Will that work? Hartwell has connections throughout the territory." "He does, but the current governor has been cracking down on financial irregularities, and he is unlikely to ignore credible allegations of fraud." Garrett handed her the paper with several names and addresses. "These are officials you should contact. I can file the initial complaint on your behalf if you wish to retain my services." Florence calculated quickly in her head. Legal fees would consume most of her remaining savings, but keeping her ranch was worth the cost. Yes, please file everything necessary to stop the foreclosure and initiate an investigation. How much will this cost? My retainer is $50, which will cover the initial filings. If this goes to trial, we can discuss additional fees at that time. Florence counted out $50 in bills and coins, money she had kept hidden in her house for emergencies. This certainly qualified. Garrett gave her a receipt and promised to file all necessary documents within 2 days. One more thing, Florence said as she prepared to leave. If Hartwell attempts to seize my property by force while these filings are in progress, what recourse do I have? Defend yourself and document everything. If he uses violence or intimidation to try to take your land, that will strengthen your case considerably. Garrett's expression grew serious. But Miss Dawson, I need you to understand the stakes here. Hartwell is not going to accept this challenge gracefully. You need to be prepared for him to escalate. I understand. Thank you for your help. Florence left the lawyer's office feeling better than she had in months. She had evidence, legal representation, and a plan that did not involve marrying a man she despised or losing everything her father had built. Now she just needed to get back to her ranch and hope that Lucas had been able to hold things together in her absence. The return journey seemed to take twice as long as the trip to Santa Fe. Florence kept imagining disasters, Hartwell burning her house, stealing her cattle, hurting Lucas. By the time the stagecoach finally rolled into Oro Grande late in the afternoon, she was wound tight with anxiety. She retrieved her horse from the livery and rode hard toward her property, arriving just as the sun was setting. Everything looked intact from a distance, and Florence felt some of her tension ease as she spotted smoke rising from the bunkhouse chimney. She rode straight to the barn, dismounted, and was unsaddling her horse when Lucas appeared in the doorway. "Welcome back," he said with a slight smile. "I was starting to worry you had decided Santa Fe was preferable to dealing with Hartwell." "How did things go here?" "Quiet, actually. Hartwell sent 2 men the day after you left to ask about my employment situation. I explained that I worked for you, I was armed, and I had instructions to defend this property. They left without incident." Lucas took her saddle and began putting the tack away with practiced efficiency. "No one has been back since, but I have been keeping watch. How did your trip go?" Florence pulled out the envelope of documents and quickly explained everything she had learned. The fraudulent mortgage, the lawyer in Santa Fe, the complaint filed with the territorial governor. Lucas listened intently, his expression growing increasingly impressed. "So essentially, you just checkmated Hartwell legally while protecting yourself from foreclosure. That is impressive, Florence. We will see if it holds. Garrett warned me that Hartwell is likely to escalate rather than accept this challenge." Florence realized suddenly how exhausted she was from 2 days of traveling and stress. "But at least now I have options beyond marriage or homelessness. Come on, let me fix you some dinner. You look like you're about to fall over." Lucas gestured toward the house, and Florence followed gratefully. While Lucas cooked, Florence changed out of her travel clothes and into a simple work dress, then joined him in the kitchen. He had made beef stew from supplies she had left, and it tasted better than anything Florence remembered eating recently. "You are a better cook than I expected," she commented. "When you spend years working remote ranches, you learn to cook or you starve. I am not fancy, but I can make basic food taste decent." Lucas refilled her bowl without asking. "Tell me honestly, how do you think Hartwell will react to what you have done?" "Poorly. He is a man accustomed to getting what he wants, and I have just made it clear that I am not going to be bullied or manipulated." Florence met Lucas's eyes across the table. "There is a good chance he will try something violent or illegal to force the issue before my lawyer can complete the filings. I figured as much. While you were gone, I did some scouting around your property and found 3 different vantage points where someone could watch this place unobserved. I also found evidence that Hartwell's men have been surveying your northern hills, probably looking for signs of silver deposits. Did they find anything?" "Hard to say, but it confirms that Hartwell's interest in your property is about more than just acquiring land or forcing you into marriage. He believes there is money to be made here, which means he's not going to give up easily." They talked long into the night, developing contingency plans for various scenarios. Lucas had a strategic mind that Florence appreciated, and he treated her as an equal partner in the planning rather than someone to be protected or managed. By the time they finally called it a night, Florence felt as prepared as possible for whatever Hartwell might attempt next. 3 days later, the banker made his move. Florence was in the barn mending tack when she heard Lucas's warning whistle. She grabbed her rifle and ran outside to see a group of 8 riders approaching the property. Hartwell rode at the front, with Sheriff Morrison beside him and 6 ranch hands behind them. Florence's heart sank when she saw the sheriff, but she kept her rifle ready and her expression calm as the group stopped in front of her house. "Miss Dawson, I have a court order allowing me to seize this property for failure to pay your mortgage." Hartwell held up an official-looking document. "You need to vacate immediately." "That is interesting considering I filed a formal complaint with the territorial governor 3 days ago alleging fraud and demanding an investigation into your banking practices. Any foreclosure proceeding should be frozen pending that investigation." Florence kept her voice level and authoritative. Hartwell's face reddened. "You did what?" "I verified the actual amount of my father's mortgage with the Territorial Land Office. $800, not $2,000. Either you have been defrauding me, Mr. Hartwell, or you are engaged in illegal lending practices with usurious interest rates. Either way, I have legal representation in Santa Fe, and they have filed all appropriate complaints with territorial authorities." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Is this true, Hartwell? Because if there is a legitimate dispute about the mortgage amount, I cannot enforce a foreclosure." "The mortgage is legitimate, and Miss Dawson is simply trying to delay the inevitable." Hartwell turned his horse to face the sheriff directly. "I want you to remove her from this property immediately." "I need to see proof that the territorial complaint has been received and processed before I can do that. Otherwise, you are asking me to potentially remove someone from legally owned property based on disputed financial claims." Morrison was clearly trying to thread a careful political needle between supporting the town's most powerful businessman and avoiding legal consequences. Lucas appeared from behind the barn, his rifle held casually but ready. "You might also want to consider that Miss Dawson is not alone on this property, and we are both armed and prepared to defend her legal rights. Unless you are prepared to have a shootout over what appears to be a civil legal dispute, I would suggest everyone go back to town and let the lawyers sort this out." "Who the hell are you?" Hartwell demanded. "Lucas Darrow. I work for Miss Dawson, and before you ask, yes, I am prepared to use this rifle to defend my employer's property rights." Lucas's voice was calm but absolutely serious. The tension stretched taut as everyone assessed the situation. Hartwell clearly wanted to force the issue, but the presence of the sheriff, the legal complications Florence had introduced, and the reality of potentially starting a gunfight over unclear grounds made him hesitate. Finally, Morrison spoke. "We are going back to town until I can verify the status of these legal filings. Hartwell, if Miss Dawson has properly filed a complaint alleging fraud, then any foreclosure has to wait until that is resolved. That is the law." "This is not over," Hartwell said, glaring at Florence with undisguised hatred. "You are making a very serious mistake, Miss Dawson." "The only mistake would be allowing you to steal my property through fraud and intimidation. I know the actual amount of my father's mortgage, and I have the documentation to prove your claims are false. If you continue to harass me or attempt illegal foreclosure, I will add those charges to my complaint." Florence kept her rifle pointed toward the ground, but her stance firm. The group wheeled their horses and rode back toward town, leaving Florence and Lucas standing in tense silence until they disappeared from view. Only then did Florence allow herself to lower her weapon and release the breath she had been holding. "That went better than I expected," Lucas said quietly. "He is not done. You saw his face. Hartwell is furious, and furious men do stupid things." Florence walked back into the barn on shaking legs and sat down on a hay bale. "Thank you for backing me up. I do not think Morrison would have hesitated if it had just been me alone." Lucas followed her into the barn and leaned against a post. "You held your own. The legal maneuvering you did in Santa Fe changed the entire situation. Hartwell expected you to be helpless, and instead you came back with documentation and lawyers. That is not something he can easily counter. He can still make my life miserable while the investigation plays out. He can refuse me credit at stores he controls, turn the town against me even more than they already have, make it impossible for me to conduct normal business. Florence rubbed her face tiredly. I am not sure how long I can hold out if he decides to wage a war of attrition. One problem at a time. Right now, you have successfully blocked his foreclosure attempt. That is a significant victory. Lucas pulled a piece of straw from the bale and studied it thoughtfully. The question is what he does next. My guess is he will try to gather evidence to counter your fraud claims while simultaneously making things as difficult as possible for you locally. Which means I need to stay ahead of him legally and make sure my lawyer in Santa Fe keeps pushing the investigation forward. Florence stood, feeling her determination return. I did not come this far to lose now. Over the following weeks, an uneasy stalemate settled over the situation. Florence's lawyer filed additional documents with territorial authorities, and an official investigation was opened into Hartwell's banking practices. The banker retaliated by using his influence to make Florence's life difficult in subtle ways. The general store suddenly claimed her credit was no good. The blacksmith was always too busy to take her work, and several neighboring ranchers who had been cordial in the past now refused to speak to her. Through it all, Lucas remained a steady presence. He worked the ranch with quiet competence, helped Florence manage her reduced cattle herd, and never complained about the hardships or the danger. As the weeks turned into months and winter gave way to early spring, Florence found herself relying on Lucas for more than just physical labor. He was someone she could talk to honestly, someone who understood why she was fighting so hard to keep her independence, someone who never suggested that marriage to Hartwell might actually be the easier path. They fell into comfortable routines. Morning coffee before dawn, long days working cattle and mending fences, evenings discussing strategy, and occasionally just talking about their lives before they ended up on this New Mexico ranch together. Florence learned that Lucas had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a widow who had struggled to raise him after his father died in the Civil War. He had tried to be the respectable son his mother wanted, working as a clerk in a law office for 2 miserable years before finally admitting he hated everything about city life. I took my savings, bought a horse, and just started riding west, Lucas told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold and purple. I had no plan, no destination, just this overwhelming need to find out who I actually was instead of who everyone expected me to be. Did you find out? Florence asked. I found out I am happiest working with my hands, sleeping under the stars, and moving when I feel like moving. I found out I am not built for staying in one place or conforming to other people's expectations of what makes a successful life. Lucas glanced at her. I also found out I respect people who know themselves and have the courage to defend who they are, even when the whole world is telling them to be someone different. Florence felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. Over the past 2 months, she had grown to appreciate Lucas not just as a ranch hand, but as a person. He was thoughtful and steady, with a dry sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly and made her laugh. He treated her as an equal, neither patronizing her capabilities nor expecting her to fit some feminine ideal of helplessness and deference. He was exactly what he had claimed to be that first day, someone who wanted to live authentically and had no interest in forcing anyone else into molds they did not fit. She was also, Florence realized, with something approaching panic, falling in love with him. It was the worst possible timing. Lucas had been clear from the beginning that he was only staying until spring, that he intended to continue north to Colorado and keep drifting. He was not looking for permanence or attachment. Florence had agreed to those terms, had told herself that she only needed temporary help to get through the crisis with Hartwell. She had not planned on Lucas becoming someone essential to her daily happiness, someone whose opinion she valued, and whose presence had transformed her lonely ranch into something that felt like home again. She tried to ignore the feelings, to focus on the practical concerns of fighting Hartwell and keeping her ranch secure. But as the weather warmed and spring truly arrived in New Mexico, bringing wildflowers to the hills and green grass to the pastures, Florence found it increasingly difficult to imagine what her life would look like when Lucas eventually rode away. One afternoon in late April, a rider arrived from Santa Fe with a message from Florence's lawyer. The territorial investigation had uncovered evidence of multiple fraudulent loans issued by Hartwell, and the banker was being formally charged with financial crimes. More importantly, the investigation had confirmed that Florence's father's actual mortgage was $800, and Hartwell's claim of $2,000 was based on a forged document. The foreclosure order was being permanently dismissed, and Florence was being issued a clear title to her property. "You won," Lucas said after reading the letter. "Florence, you actually won. Hartwell cannot touch your ranch now." Florence read the letter 3 times, barely able to believe what she was seeing. She had won. After months of fear and fighting and uncertainty, she had successfully defended her ranch, her independence, and her right to live life on her own terms. She started laughing, then crying, then laughing again as the relief crashed over her in waves. Lucas pulled her into a hug, and Florence clung to him, letting herself feel everything she had been suppressing for so long. When she finally pulled back, she found Lucas looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now I pay off the actual $800 I owe. I keep running my ranch, and I live my life without Thomas Hartwell trying to control every aspect of it." Florence wiped her eyes, feeling lighter than she had in a year. "And you get your $20 and head north to Colorado, just like you planned." Something flickered across Lucas's face, gone too quickly for Florence to identify. Right, that was the agreement. They stood there in awkward silence, the letter from Santa Fe still clutched in Florence's hand. There was so much Florence wanted to say, but the words stuck in her throat. Lucas had never promised anything beyond temporary help. He had a life he wanted to live, places he wanted to see, and Florence had no right to ask him to give that up because she had been foolish enough to fall in love. "When were you planning to leave?" she finally asked. "I figured after spring roundup, so probably in the next 2 weeks. Lucas would not quite meet her eyes. "Unless you need help beyond that?" "No, I can manage now that the legal situation is resolved. You have certainly earned your $20 and then some." Florence forced herself to smile. "Thank you, Lucas, for everything. I genuinely do not think I would have kept my ranch without your help." "You would have found a way. You are the most stubborn person I have ever met." Lucas smiled back, but it did not reach his eyes. "I should get back to work on that north fence line. We want everything in good shape before I go." He left, and Florence stood alone holding the letter that represented her victory, feeling like she had somehow lost something precious in the process of winning. Over the next week, the news of Hartwell's charges spread through Oro Grande. The banker had been removed from his position pending trial, and a territorial bank examiner had taken over operations to investigate the full extent of his fraudulent activities. Several other ranchers came forward with similar stories of suspicious loan increases and impossible payment demands. The town's attitude toward Florence shifted from disapproval to grudging respect as people realized she had exposed corruption that affected multiple families. Sheriff Morrison even came out to her ranch to apologize for not taking her complaints more seriously initially. Florence accepted the apology with more grace than she felt, and made it clear that she expected better protection of property rights going forward. Through all of it, Lucas continued working as if nothing had changed, but Florence could feel the distance growing between them. He was preparing to leave, and she was trying to prepare herself for his departure, and neither of them seemed willing or able to acknowledge the thing that had developed between them over the long winter months. 2 days before Lucas was scheduled to leave, Florence's neighbor rode over with news that a group of Hartwell's former ranch hands were talking in town about teaching Miss Dawson a lesson for ruining their boss. The neighbor, a weathered rancher named Miller, who had also been victimized by Hartwell's fraud, suggested Florence and Lucas might want to stay alert for trouble. That night, they took turns keeping watch, and Florence spent her sleepless hours trying to figure out how to tell Lucas that she did not want him to go, that she had fallen in love with him, that the thought of running her ranch alone again felt unbearable now that she knew what it was like to have a true partner. The attack came just before dawn. Florence was on watch when she heard horses approaching fast. She rang the warning bell and grabbed her rifle, and Lucas emerged from the bunkhouse already armed and alert. 6 riders appeared in the growing light, and Florence recognized several of them as men who had worked for Hartwell. "Time to teach you about respecting your betters," one of them shouted. "Hartwell might be finished, but you are not getting away with destroying him." They started shooting, and Florence and Lucas returned fire from defensive positions they had prepared months earlier. The fight was brief and chaotic, bullets splintering wood and kicking up dust. Florence saw one attacker fall from his horse and another wheeled away clutching his arm. Lucas fired with methodical precision, driving the riders back without trying for fatal shots. Within 10 minutes, the attack was over. The remaining riders fled, leaving one wounded man behind who Morrison would later arrest. Florence and Lucas emerged from their positions, checking each other for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Lucas asked, his hands running over her arms and shoulders, as if to verify she was intact. "I am fine. You?" Florence realized she was shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "Not a scratch." Lucas pulled her against him, and Florence let herself rest her forehead against his chest, listening to his racing heartbeat slow. "This is my life," she said quietly. "This ranch, this struggle, this constant fight to maintain my independence in a world that would prefer I just conform and disappear. It is not easy, and it is not safe, and most people think I am crazy for wanting it. I know. You should go to Colorado like you planned. You have already stayed longer than you intended, gotten involved in more danger than you signed up for. You deserve to live the drifting life you want without being tied down to someone else's battles." Florence made herself step back and look up at Lucas. "But before you go, I need to tell you something. I love you. I was not planning to, and I know it complicates everything, but I cannot let you ride away without being honest about how I feel." Lucas stared at her for a long moment, his green eyes intense. "You love me?" "Yes. And I am not telling you this to make you feel obligated or to ask you to change your plans. You have been clear about what you want from life, and I respect that. I just needed you to know before you left." "Florence, I need to tell you something too." Lucas took her hands. "I've been lying to myself for weeks now, pretending that I was going to ride north and continue drifting like nothing had changed. But everything has changed. You changed it. This ranch, this fight, you, all of it, has become more important to me than any abstract idea of freedom or wandering." "What are you saying?" "I am saying I do not want to go to Colorado. I want to stay here with you if you will have me. Not as a hired hand, but as a partner. Someone who shares your battles and your victories, who builds something lasting instead of always moving on." Lucas smiled slightly. "Turns out I do not fit the mold of a drifter as well as I thought. I'm apparently someone who wants to put down roots with a stubborn ranch owner in New Mexico." Florence felt joy bloom in her chest like sunrise. "Are you certain? Because this life is hard. Lucas, the ranch will always require work, and there will always be someone trying to tell me I should be someone different. If you stay, you are choosing all of that. I am choosing you. The ranch and the battles and the hard work are all part of that, but mostly I am choosing you, Florence, the woman who refused to fit any mold and taught me that authentic living sometimes means finding the place and person you want to stay for." Lucas cupped her face in his hands. "I love you. I think I have loved you since that first day when you stood there with your rifle and your determination and told me exactly what you needed." Florence kissed him then, pouring months of longing and fear and hope into it. Lucas kissed her back with equal intensity, and for the first time since her father died, Florence felt like she was not facing the world alone. When they finally broke apart, the sun was rising over the New Mexico hills, painting everything gold. They stood together in front of Florence's ranch house, and Florence felt the future opening up before her in ways she had not dared imagine. "So what happens now?" Lucas asked. Now we go tell Sheriff Morrison about the attack, make sure those men are arrested, and finish putting this whole situation with Hartwell to rest." Florence laced her fingers through his. "And then we run this ranch together and build the life we both want instead of the lives everyone else thinks we should want." "That sounds perfect." They rode into Oro Grande together that morning, and Morrison arrested the attackers based on their testimony and the wounded man's confession. The sheriff also informed them that Hartwell would be standing trial in 3 months on multiple charges of fraud and corruption. Florence would need to testify, but her lawyer was confident the case was strong. Over the following weeks, Florence and Lucas transformed their partnership from temporary necessity to permanent commitment. They moved Lucas's belongings from the bunkhouse to the main house, and Florence found she liked having someone to share her space with, someone who understood when to give her room to be independent and when to offer support. The town's opinion of their arrangement varied from scandalized to supportive, but Florence discovered she cared less about others' judgments now that she had someone who truly understood her. They were married in early June in a simple ceremony at the ranch with just a few friends present. Lucas wore his best shirt and looked nervous and happy, and Florence wore a cream-colored dress she had sewn herself and felt more certain about this decision than anything else in her life. The territorial trial happened in July, and Hartwell was convicted on multiple counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and stripped of all his business holdings. The bank was restructured under new management, and several families who had been victimized by Hartwell's schemes were able to recover their properties or renegotiate fair mortgages. Florence testified clearly and without emotion about the forged documents and the intimidation she had faced. Watching Hartwell be led away in chains felt like closing a long, difficult chapter of her life. With the legal battles finally resolved, Florence and Lucas threw themselves into building their ranch into something successful. They increased their cattle herd carefully, reinvesting profits into improvements and expansion. Lucas proved to be excellent at negotiating with buyers and managing the financial side of ranching, while Florence excelled at animal husbandry and land management. Together, they made the ranch profitable in ways her father had never quite achieved. The first winter of their marriage was harder than either had expected. They had to learn how to navigate disagreements and combine their different approaches to problem solving. Florence struggled with letting go of complete control and trusting Lucas to make major decisions. Lucas struggled with understanding when Florence needed space versus when she needed support. But they worked through each conflict with honesty and patience, and their partnership grew stronger with each challenge they faced together. By their first anniversary, Florence knew she was pregnant. She told Lucas one evening in August, while they were sitting on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the distant mountains. "We are going to have a baby," she said simply. Lucas turned to her with an expression of pure wonder. "Are you certain?" "Very certain. Sometime in February, I think." He pulled her into his arms, and Florence felt his joy radiating through the embrace. They sat together in the gathering darkness, listening to thunder and planning for their growing family. Their son was born in February 1884 during a cold snap that froze the water in the barrels but left the sky crystalline and brilliant. Lucas rode for the midwife from Oro Grande, and Florence labored through the night with stubborn determination, refusing to make more than the minimal amount of noise. When the baby finally arrived at dawn, Florence held him and felt overwhelmed by fierce protective love. They named him Henry after Florence's father, and he had Lucas's green eyes and Florence's auburn hair. Lucas proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Henry when he cried at night and singing surprisingly good lullabies in a soft baritone Florence had never heard him use before. Parenthood transformed them both in ways Florence had not anticipated. She discovered she could be both a rancher and a mother, that the roles were not mutually exclusive despite what society suggested. Lucas discovered he loved teaching their son about the ranch and the land, passing on knowledge with the same patience he had shown Florence when they first started working together. The years rolled forward with the rhythm of ranch life, Calving season, spring roundups, summer heat, fall preparations, winter endurance. Henry grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed his parents around the ranch and asked endless questions about cattle and horses and the land. When he was 4 years old, Florence gave birth to twin daughters, Grace and Catherine, and their household became even more chaotic and joyful. Lucas proved endlessly patient with their children, teaching them to ride and rope, telling them stories about his drifting days before he met their mother, and making sure all three understood that they could be whoever they wanted to be regardless of what anyone else expected. Florence watched her husband with their children and felt grateful every day that he had chosen to stay, that he had been willing to give up his wandering life for roots and permanence. One evening when Henry was 10 and the twins were 6, Florence and Lucas sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. The ranch had grown prosperous over the years, and they now ran 150 head of cattle on expanded land. They had built additions onto the house, repaired all the old buildings, and even hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work. "Do you ever regret staying?" Florence asked Lucas. "Do you ever wish you had continued north to Colorado and kept drifting?" Lucas considered the question seriously, as he always did. "Sometimes I wonder what that life would have been like. But wondering is not the same as regret. I made a choice to stay, Florence, and it was the best decision I have ever made. This life we have built together, this family, this ranch, it is everything I did not know I wanted until I found it." "I used to think independence meant never needing anyone," Florence said. "But real independence is choosing who you want to need, choosing who you want to build a life with on your own terms." And we definitely did that. Lucas reached over and took her hand. "You never fit anyone's mold, and I never wanted you to." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the New Mexico sky in shades of amber and rose. Their children's laughter carried on the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed contentedly. Florence thought about the frightened young woman who had faced down Thomas Hartwell with a rifle and determination, who had refused to surrender her independence or her ranch. That woman had been strong and brave, but she had also been alone. Now Florence was stronger because she had chosen a partner who enhanced her capabilities rather than diminishing them. She was braver because she had someone to be brave with. She was happier because she had built a life that reflected her authentic self rather than society's expectations. Henry ran up to the porch, breathless with excitement about a lizard he had caught. Grace and Catherine were arguing about whose turn it was to help feed the chickens. Normal, chaotic family life unfolded around them, and Florence felt contentment settle into her bones. As the children grew older, Florence and Lucas made sure to teach them the same lessons they had learned through hard experience. They taught Henry that real strength meant respecting others' choices and capabilities, not forcing people into prescribed roles. They taught Grace and Catherine that they could be ranchers or teachers or whatever they wanted, that their gender did not limit their possibilities. The ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where unconventional thinking was welcomed, where a woman could run cattle alongside her husband without anyone questioning her competence. Young people who did not fit traditional molds sometimes found their way to the ranch, looking for work and acceptance. Florence and Lucas hired based on capability and character, not on whether someone conformed to expected social roles. When Henry turned 18, he announced he wanted to attend university in Colorado to study agriculture science. Florence's first instinct was to protest, to point out that he was needed on the ranch, but she caught Lucas's eye and remembered her own fight for self-determination. They sent Henry to school with their blessing and financial support, trusting that he would return when he was ready, or forge his own path if that was what he needed. Grace showed aptitude for numbers and business, taking over the ranch's financial management by the time she was 16. Catherine inherited her mother's gift with animals and spent hours gentling horses and nursing sick cattle back to health. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts, and Florence felt proud that her children were becoming fully themselves rather than trying to fit predetermined expectations. The years brought changes and challenges. There were droughts that tested their water management, market downturns that required financial creativity, and occasional conflicts with neighbors who still believed women had no business running ranches. But Florence and Lucas faced each challenge as partners, their bond strengthened by shared struggles and victories. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Lucas surprised Florence with a small cabin he had built in the hills behind their ranch, near a spring-fed stream where wildflowers bloomed each summer. It was a place where they could escape when ranch life grew overwhelming, a retreat that was just theirs. "I wanted you to have a place that was purely for yourself," Lucas explained. "Somewhere you could go to remember who you are beyond wife and mother and rancher, somewhere you could just be Florence." Florence cried then, understanding the depth of love and perception behind the gift. Even after 20 years of marriage, Lucas still understood her need for independence and solitude, still respected the parts of her identity that existed separate from their shared life. They spent a week at the cabin, just the two of them, talking and remembering and dreaming about the years ahead. They were both in their early 40s now, their children nearly grown, their ranch secure. The desperation and fear of those early years had faded into memory, replaced by hard-won peace and prosperity. "We did it," Florence said one evening as they sat by the stream. "We built exactly the life we wanted, on our own terms." "We did," Lucas agreed, "and it was harder and better than I ever imagined possible." When Henry graduated from university and returned to the ranch with new ideas about sustainable grazing and soil management, Florence and Lucas stepped back gradually, allowing the next generation to take leadership while remaining available as advisors and support. Grace married a teacher from Oro Grande who loved numbers as much as she did, and they moved into a house on the edge of the ranch property. Catherine announced she wanted to start breeding horses professionally, and her parents helped her convert one of the old barns into proper stables. The ranch evolved and expanded, becoming a multi-generational enterprise that reflected the values Florence and Lucas had fought to establish. The family gathered for Sunday dinners, 3 generations sharing food and stories and laughter. Florence looked around her table at those meals and marveled at the unexpected richness of her life. She had fought so hard to maintain her independence, to resist being forced into someone else's vision of who she should be. And in that fight, she had found a partner who enhanced her autonomy rather than restricting it, who built with her rather than trying to shape her, who loved her exactly as she was. As Florence approached her 50th birthday, she found herself reflecting on the long journey from that terrified young woman facing Thomas Hartwell's ultimatum to the matriarch of a thriving ranch and family. The path had been neither easy nor predictable, but it had been entirely her own choice. Lucas still looked at her the way he had that first day, with respect and appreciation and love. They still worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs and thoughts after so many years of partnership. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the New Mexico sky and counting themselves fortunate. On Florence's 50th birthday, their entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Henry brought his new wife, a school teacher he had met in Colorado. Grace and her husband brought their 2 young children. Catherine arrived with a prize stallion she had been training for months. Friends and neighbors from throughout the territory came to honor the woman who had defied expectations and built something remarkable. During the celebration, Florence stood with Lucas on their porch, surveying the gathering of people who represented their life's work. "We made something lasting," she said quietly, "something that will continue long after we are gone." "We did," Lucas agreed. "And it started because you refused to fit the mold they wanted, and I fell in love with exactly that refusal." Florence kissed him then, in front of everyone, publicly demonstrating the love and partnership that had sustained them through 25 years of marriage. The crowd cheered, and their grandchildren laughed, and the celebration continued around them. As the sun set that evening, painting the New Mexico hills in familiar shades of gold and purple, Florence felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with societal expectations or conventional success. She had lived authentically, loved deeply, and built a legacy that reflected her truest self. She had not fit the mold, and that had made all the difference. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Florence and Lucas grew older together, their bodies showing the effects of decades of hard work, but their partnership remaining strong. They became grandparents multiple times over, teaching the youngest generation about cattle and land and the importance of being true to yourself. When Florence was 62, Lucas fell ill with pneumonia during a harsh winter. For 2 weeks, Florence nursed him with fierce determination, refusing to accept that she might lose him. She sat by his bedside through long nights, holding his hand and telling him about all the things they still needed to do together. Lucas recovered slowly, his strength returning as winter gave way to spring. "You are too stubborn to let me die," he told her, when he was finally well enough to sit up and complain about being confined to bed. "You are absolutely right," Florence replied. "We have decades left together, and I am not letting you escape that easily." They had been lucky in so many ways, Florence reflected. Lucky that Lucas had appeared at exactly the moment she needed help. Lucky that they had both been brave enough to acknowledge their feelings and build something real. Lucky that they had survived the dangers and challenges that could have destroyed them. But it was not just luck, she knew. It was also choice, effort, and unwavering commitment to each other and to the life they had decided to build. On their 30th anniversary, their children surprised them with a family portrait. Everyone gathered together at the ranch with the New Mexico landscape stretching behind them. Florence looked at that portrait and saw not just family, but legacy. 3 generations of people who had been raised to think independently, to respect others' choices, to build rather than conform. Florence was 70 when Lucas died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night. She woke to find him still beside her, his hand in hers, his face peaceful. The grief was enormous and all-consuming, but so was the gratitude. They had 40 years together, 4 decades of partnership and love and shared purpose. Not everyone got that, Florence knew. Some people spent their entire lives never finding the person who loved them exactly as they were. She buried Lucas on the hill overlooking their ranch, with a simple marker that read his name, his dates, and the inscription, "He chose freedom and found home." Their children and grandchildren surrounded her at the service, offering support and sharing memories of the man who had helped build their family's foundation. Florence continued running the ranch with Henry's help, refusing to slow down despite her age. She took daily rides to Lucas's grave, telling him about the ranch operations, the grandchildren's achievements, the changes in the territory. It comforted her to maintain that conversation, to feel his presence in the land they had worked together. She lived to be 83, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. Her final days were spent surrounded by family in the house she and Lucas had built together, looking out at the New Mexico hills she had fought so hard to keep. On her last day, Florence gathered her children and grandchildren around her bed. "I want you to remember," she told them, her voice still strong despite her failing body, "that the most important thing you can do in life is be true to yourself. I did not fit the mold they wanted, and your grandfather did not want me to fit any mold. That is how we built something real and lasting. That is how you build a life worth living." She died peacefully that evening, with her family's hands holding hers, and was buried beside Lucas on the hill. Their graves overlooked the ranch that represented everything they had fought for and built together, a permanent testament to 2 people who refused to conform and found freedom in that refusal. The ranch continued for generations after, run by Florence and Lucas's descendants, who inherited not just land and cattle, but the values of authenticity, independence, and mutual respect that had made everything possible. The story of the stubborn woman who defied a corrupt banker and the drifting cowboy who chose to stay became family legend, told and retold to remind each new generation that the courage to be yourself can transform not just your own life, but create ripples that extend far into the future. In Oro Grande, New Mexico, a historical marker eventually appeared noting the ranch's significance as one of the first in the territory to be successfully co-managed by a woman, and as a place that helped expose financial corruption in the territorial banking system. The marker mentioned Florence Dawson and Lucas Darrow by name, preserving their story for future generations who might need inspiration to resist conformity and fight for their own authentic lives. The land they fought for remained in their family for over a century, each generation adding their own contributions while maintaining the core values Florence and Lucas had established. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the New Mexico hills in shades of gold and purple, some family members swore they could still feel the presence of their ancestors, the stubborn woman and the cowboy who chose to stay, forever watching over the legacy they had built together. Their love story became the foundation of everything that came after, proving that sometimes the greatest romance is not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but about two people choosing each other every single day, building a life that honors both individual authenticity and shared purpose, refusing to fit molds, and finding freedom in that refusal. Florence and Lucas had shown that real love enhances independence rather than restricting it, that partnership means supporting each other's full humanity, and that the courage to be yourself can change not just your own life, but create a legacy that echoes through generations. Their story ended, but their impact continued. A permanent reminder that the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be anything other than exactly who you are, and find someone who loves you not despite that authenticity, but because of it.